In the farthest reaches of the galaxy, where ancient civilizations have risen and fallen like waves against cosmic shores, there exists a truth that chills even the most hardened spacefaring races. Some things are too powerful to live, yet too proud to die. What happens when the apex predator of the universe, a being that has consumed worlds and terrorized entire star systems for millennia, finally encounters something it cannot defeat, cannot consume, and cannot understand? What drives a creature of pure destruction to seek the one thing it has never needed? Help. On a forgotten farming world at the edge of human space, Thomas Chen tends his crops with the same dedication his ancestors showed on ancient Earth. He expects his biggest worry to be the harvest season. He doesn't expect to find the most feared entity in known space collapsed in his wheat field, begging for the one thing it has never experienced: death. But in the vast tapestry of the cosmos, sometimes the smallest threads hold the greatest power. Sometimes a simple farmer with dirt under his fingernails possesses something that empires and godlike beings cannot comprehend. Sometimes humanity's greatest strength isn't in its weapons or technology, it's in its stubborn refusal to accept that anything is impossible. This is the story of what happens when unstoppable force meets unmovable compassion, when ancient cosmic horror encounters human ingenuity, and when the most feared predator in the galaxy learns that true power sometimes comes wrapped in overalls and carried in calloused hands. Thomas Chen wiped the sweat from his forehead as he guided his hover tractor through the golden wheat fields of New Harmony. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rolling farmland, and the gentle hum of the machinery mixed with the whisper of grain stalks swaying in the breeze. At 53, Thomas had spent most of his life on this remote agricultural world, following in the footsteps of generations of farmers who had carved civilization from the wilderness of space. New Harmony sat on the outer rim of human territory, far from the bustling trade routes and political centers of the Federation. It was exactly the kind of place Thomas preferred: quiet, peaceful, and free from the complications that seemed to plague the more developed worlds. Here, a man could work the soil, watch the seasons change, and live a simple life without worrying about galactic politics or alien threats. The harvest was coming along well this year. The genetically modified wheat had adapted perfectly to New Harmony's slightly longer growing season, and the yields were exceeding even Thomas's optimistic projections. He was already calculating the profit margins when something caught his eye near the northern edge of his property. There was a depression in the wheat field, as if something massive had fallen from the sky and crushed a circular area roughly 50 meters in diameter. The stalks weren't just bent, they were completely flattened, pressed into the earth with such force that the soil itself had been compressed several inches deep. Thomas brought the hover tractor to a stop and climbed down, his boots crunching on the devastated grain. As he approached the center of the circle, Thomas noticed something that made him pause. The air felt different here, thicker somehow, and charged with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand up. There was a smell too, like ozone mixed with something metallic and ancient. He had never experienced anything quite like it. At the very center of the destroyed crop circle lay what appeared to be a massive tarp or blanket, dark and seemingly made of some kind of organic material. It rose and fell with a slow, rhythmic motion that suggested something alive beneath it. Thomas approached cautiously, his farmer's instincts telling him to be careful around unknown animals, especially large ones. The blanket was enormous, easily large enough to cover his entire farmhouse. As he got closer, he realized it wasn't a blanket at all. It was some kind of wing membrane, leathery and dark, with an intricate network of veins visible beneath the surface. The rhythmic motion was breathing, deep and labored, like that of an injured creature. Thomas had heard stories, of course. Every human in the outer colonies had heard the legends passed down by traders and spacers who claimed to have witnessed things beyond imagination. Stories of vast creatures that moved between the stars, beings so ancient and powerful that they remembered the birth of galaxies. Most people dismissed such tales as spacer folklore, the kind of stories that grew with each telling until they bore no resemblance to whatever grain of truth had started them. But standing here in his ruined wheat field, looking at something that could not be explained by any terrestrial biology he knew, Thomas began to wonder if perhaps those stories weren't entirely fictional after all. He reached out tentatively and touched the wing membrane. It was warm, almost feverish, and incredibly tough. The texture reminded him of leather that had been worn smooth by centuries of use, but there was an underlying vitality to it that no dead material could possess. As his fingers made contact, the breathing beneath the wing suddenly hitched, and Thomas jerked his hand back. A voice spoke, not through the air but directly into his mind. The words formed themselves in his consciousness with such clarity that, for a moment, Thomas thought someone was standing right beside him. "Please," the voice said, and it carried with it a weight of exhaustion and desperation that was almost overwhelming. "Please, I beg of you, end this suffering." Thomas stumbled backward, his heart racing. He looked around frantically, but there was no one else in sight. The nearest farmhouse was kilometers away, and his communication device was back in the hover tractor. He was completely alone with whatever was hidden beneath that massive wing. "Who's there?" he called out, feeling somewhat foolish for speaking aloud to what appeared to be an empty field. "Show yourself!" The wing shifted slightly, revealing the edge of what might have been a head or snout. The voice came again, weaker this time but still resonating directly in his thoughts. "I cannot move, human. I am dying, but I cannot die. I have tried for longer than your species has existed, but death will not take me. I am trapped in this flesh, in this existence, and I cannot escape." Thomas felt his knees go weak. He had never been particularly religious, but the sheer otherworldliness of the situation was making him reconsider a lot of his assumptions about reality. He forced himself to remain calm, drawing on the steady pragmatism that had served him well through decades of farming. "What are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a long pause before the response came, and when it did, it was tinged with something that might have been bitter amusement. "Your species has many names for what I am. In your ancient languages you called us dragons, though that word carries implications that do not fully capture our nature. We are old, human, old beyond your comprehension. We were already ancient when your sun was young, and we will exist long after it has burned to ash." The wing shifted again, and Thomas caught a glimpse of scales that shimmered with an iridescent quality that seemed to absorb and reflect light in impossible ways. Each scale was the size of his hand, and they overlapped in patterns that reminded him of medieval armor. "But I do not wish to exist any longer," the voice continued. "I have seen too much, experienced too much. I have witnessed the birth and death of civilizations, watched species rise from primordial ooze only to destroy themselves with their own hubris. I have consumed worlds and torn apart fleets of starships. And for what? What purpose does such existence serve?" Thomas found himself sitting down heavily on the compressed earth, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. A dragon, a real, living dragon, was lying in his wheat field, asking him for help with dying. It was possibly the most surreal conversation he had ever had. "I don't understand," he said. "If you want to die, why can't you just stop? Stop eating, or throw yourself into a star or something." The bitter amusement in the voice was more pronounced now. "Do you think I have not tried? I have starved myself for centuries at a time, but my body simply draws energy from the cosmic background radiation, from the quantum foam itself. I have flown into supernovas, into black holes, into the hearts of neutron stars. Nothing can destroy this form. I am bound to it by forces that your science has not even discovered yet." Thomas rubbed his temples, trying to ward off the headache that was building behind his eyes. The conversation was taking on a philosophical weight that made his farmer's brain ache. He was much better at dealing with concrete problems. Crop diseases, equipment failures, market fluctuations. Those were things he could understand and fix. This was something else entirely. "So why come to me?" he asked. "I'm just a farmer. I don't know anything about cosmic forces or ancient beings. What could I possibly do that you haven't already tried?" The pause that followed was so long that Thomas began to wonder if the creature had fallen unconscious. When the voice finally returned, it carried a note of something that might have been hope. "Your species is different, human. In all my travels across the galaxy, in all my observations of the countless civilizations that have risen and fallen, I have never encountered anything quite like humanity. You possess a unique combination of ingenuity and stubbornness that defies logic. 1. You solve problems that should be unsolvable, overcome obstacles that should be insurmountable. Your people have a saying, 'There's always a way,' and somehow, you make it true." Thomas couldn't help but smile despite the bizarre circumstances. It was true that humans had a reputation for finding solutions to impossible problems. They had colonized hostile worlds, built thriving civilizations in the depths of space, and consistently surprised other species with their adaptability and resourcefulness. "I have been searching for someone who might possess the particular kind of thinking necessary to solve my predicament," the voice continued. "I have spoken with the greatest minds of a dozen species, consulted with beings who understand the fundamental forces of reality in ways that would shatter lesser minds. All have told me that my situation is impossible to resolve. But impossibility is a concept that your species seems to reject on principle. The dragon's wing folded back slightly, revealing more of its massive form. Thomas could see part of a neck that was easily as thick as the trunk of the ancient oak tree that grew beside his farmhouse. The scales were not just iridescent, they seemed to contain entire universes within their depths, swirling with patterns that hurt to look at directly. "I do not ask lightly," the voice said, and now there was a vulnerability in it that made Thomas's chest tighten with unexpected empathy. "I have existed for eons in solitude, believing that I was beyond such things as hope or desperation. But lying here in your field, feeling my strength finally beginning to ebb for the first time in millennia, I find that I am capable of both." Thomas stood up slowly, dusting off his work pants. He walked around the perimeter of the wing, trying to get a sense of just how large this creature was. What he could see suggested something the size of a small city, and he suspected that much of the dragon was still hidden beneath the folded wings. "What makes you think your strength is ebbing?" he asked. "You said yourself that you've tried everything and nothing has worked." "This world," the voice replied, and Thomas could hear genuine puzzlement in it. "There is something about this place, something in the soil itself, that is affecting me in ways I do not understand. I have been here for 3 of your local days, and each day I feel weaker. It is not painful exactly, but it is different. For the first time in my existence, I feel truly mortal." Thomas knelt down and scooped up a handful of the compressed earth. New Harmony's soil was rich and dark, perfect for agriculture, but he had never noticed anything particularly unusual about it. As far as he knew, the planetary surveys had found nothing out of the ordinary when the world was first colonized 50 years ago. "Maybe it's something about the way we farm here," he mused, thinking out loud. "We use a lot of organic fertilizers, crop rotation, natural pest management. The soil is full of beneficial microorganisms and complex chemical interactions." "Organic," the dragon repeated, and there was a strange note in its mental voice. "Yes, perhaps that is part of it. I have spent so long among the stars, among the cold vacuum and the burning plasma of cosmic phenomena, that I had forgotten what it feels like to be surrounded by life. Real life. Not the sterile existence of spaceborne creatures, or the artificial constructs of technological civilizations." Thomas found himself wondering about the dragon's history. What had driven such a powerful being to seek death? What kind of experiences could make immortality feel like a curse rather than a blessing? "Tell me about yourself," he said, settling back down on the ground. "If I'm going to help you, I need to understand what we're dealing with." The response came with what sounded like relief, as if the dragon had been waiting eons for someone to simply ask. "I was not always what I am now," the voice began. "Once, long ago, I was part of a species that you might consider noble, if such concepts apply to beings of our nature. We were guardians of sorts, protectors of young civilizations, shepherds of cosmic evolution. We helped primitive species develop space travel, guided them away from self-destructive paths, and occasionally intervened when cosmic threats arose that they could not handle alone." Thomas listened with growing fascination as the dragon described a galaxy far different from the one he knew. A time when ancient beings moved openly among the stars, when species worked together in cosmic harmony, when the universe itself seemed younger and more hopeful. "But power corrupts," the voice continued, "and absolute power corrupts absolutely. As one of your philosophers once observed, over time, some of my kind began to see themselves not as guardians but as rulers. They demanded worship, tribute, and absolute obedience from the species they had once protected. When their demands were refused, they became violent." The dragon's wing shuddered slightly, and Thomas could feel waves of ancient guilt and regret washing over him through their mental connection. "I tried to stop them at first. I tried to reason with my corrupted kin, to remind them of our original purpose, but they were beyond reason. And eventually, I found myself alone against an entire subspecies of beings as powerful as myself. The war that followed lasted for millennia and devastated entire regions of the galaxy." Thomas could hardly imagine the scale of such a conflict. War between beings capable of destroying stars, fought across hundreds of thousands of light years. The collateral damage alone must have been unthinkable. "In the end, I was forced to make a choice," the dragon said, and its mental voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I could continue fighting a war I could not win, watching as more and more innocent civilizations were caught in the crossfire, or I could do something that would end the conflict permanently. What did you do? Thomas asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. I consumed them, the dragon replied simply. All of them. I absorbed their life force, their knowledge, their power, and their corruption. I became a living prison for an entire subspecies of cosmic beings, and in doing so, I saved the galaxy from their tyranny. But I also condemned myself to carry their darkness within me for all eternity. The weight of that revelation settled over Thomas like a physical force. He was sitting next to a creature that had literally absorbed dozens of godlike beings into itself, that carried the accumulated power and corruption of entities that had once ruled star systems. It was a sacrifice of unimaginable magnitude, and it explained why the dragon was so desperate to find peace in death. That's why you can't die, Thomas said, understanding beginning to dawn. You're not just one being anymore. You're dozens of them, all bound together. Precisely. And they do not wish to die, even though I do. They fight against every attempt at self-destruction, using their combined power to keep this form intact and functional. I'm a prisoner in my own body, forced to endure their whispered temptations and their endless hunger for millennia without respite. Thomas stood up and began pacing around the edge of the dragon's wing, his mind racing. This was indeed a problem unlike anything he had ever encountered, but his farmer's instincts were telling him that every problem had a solution. You just had to find the right approach. What if we could separate them somehow, he suggested. If they're bound to you, maybe there's a way to unbind them. Impossible, the dragon replied immediately. The binding was done at a quantum level, woven into the very fabric of space-time itself. To undo it would require power that simply does not exist in this universe. Or maybe it would require a different kind of power, Thomas countered. You said yourself that you've never encountered anything like humanity. Maybe we think about problems differently than other species. As the day wore on, Farmer and Dragon continued their strange conversation, exploring possibilities and examining the nature of the binding that held the ancient being together. Thomas found himself oddly comfortable with the situation, as if having philosophical discussions with cosmic entities was just another part of farm life. The sun was setting behind the distant mountains when Thomas finally announced that he needed to return home for the evening. Will you be all right out here overnight? He asked, realizing as he said it how absurd the question sounded. I have survived in the vacuum of space for eons, the dragon replied with what might have been amusement. I believe I can manage one night in your field. But human, Thomas. Thank you for listening. It has been longer than you can imagine since I have been able to speak freely with someone who did not immediately try to worship me or flee in terror. Thomas gathered his tools and headed back to the hover tractor, his mind already working on the problem the dragon had presented. As he drove home through the gathering darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something obvious, some simple solution that was hiding in plain sight. Behind him, the dragon settled deeper into the earth of New Harmony, drawing strange comfort from the rich soil and the teeming life it contained. For the first time in millennia, something like hope stirred in its ancient heart. Thomas spent most of the night pacing around his farmhouse kitchen, a steaming cup of coffee growing cold in his hands as he wrestled with the dragon's problem. Sleep seemed impossible when there was a cosmic entity of unimaginable power lying in his wheat field, asking for help with something that apparently defied the laws of physics themselves. By the time dawn broke over New Harmony's rolling hills, Thomas had filled 3 notebooks with sketches, diagrams, and half-formed theories. Most of it was nonsense. The desperate attempts of a farming mind to grapple with concepts that belonged in the realm of theoretical physics. But buried among the scribbled thoughts and crossed-out equations, a few ideas had begun to take shape. He loaded his hover truck with supplies and equipment, including some items that would have seemed bizarre to anyone who didn't know about his unusual visitor. Soil analysis kits, biological scanners borrowed from the Agricultural Extension Office, and several containers of various fertilizers and soil supplements. If the dragon was right about New Harmony's soil affecting it in unprecedented ways, Thomas wanted to understand exactly what was happening. The dragon was exactly where he had left it, its massive form still covered by the leathery wing membrane. As Thomas approached, he could see that the creature had settled even deeper into the earth overnight. The depression around it had grown by several inches, as if the soil was somehow drawing the dragon down into itself. Good morning, Thomas called out as he began unloading his equipment. How are you feeling today? The mental voice that responded was noticeably weaker than it had been the day before. Weaker still, but also clearer somehow. The voices of my absorbed kin are quieter than they have been in eons. It is as if this soil is muffling their influence. Thomas nodded as he set up his testing equipment. That's what I was hoping to hear. I've been thinking about your problem all night, and I have a theory. He knelt down and began taking soil samples from around the dragon's perimeter, carefully labeling each container. You said the binding was done at a quantum level, right? Woven into the fabric of space-time itself? Correct. It is why no amount of physical force or energy can break it. The binding exists at a level far more fundamental than mere matter or energy. Thomas smiled as he worked, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was attempting to understand. That's where I think you and all those other brilliant minds you consulted made an error in assumption. You've been thinking like cosmic beings, focusing on power and force and fundamental particles. But you know what farmers think about when something won't grow properly? The dragon's interest was palpable, even through the mental connection. What do farmers think about? The soil, Thomas said simply. We think about the environment, the ecosystem, the complex web of relationships that makes life possible. You can have the most genetically perfect seeds in the galaxy, but if you plant them in dead soil, they'll never grow properly. He held up one of the soil samples, examining it in the morning light. New Harmony soil isn't just dirt, Dragon. It's alive in ways that most people don't appreciate. It's teeming with billions of microorganisms, fungi, bacteria, archaea, and other life forms that work together in incredibly complex symbiotic relationships. Thomas began setting up a portable microscope, one of his prized possessions that he used for analyzing soil health and crop diseases. These organisms don't just exist independently, they form networks. Fungal networks that can span entire continents, bacterial colonies that communicate through chemical signals, symbiotic relationships that blur the line between individual organisms and collective consciousness. The dragon was silent for a long moment, and Thomas could sense its ancient mind working through the implications of what he was suggesting. You believe that the life in this soil is somehow affecting the quantum binding that holds my absorbed kin within me? I think it's possible, Thomas replied, adjusting the microscope's settings. Quantum mechanics has always been weird. Particles that exist in multiple states simultaneously, information that travels faster than light, uncertainty principles that seem to defy logic. But what if consciousness itself operates on quantum levels? What if the collective consciousness of the soil organisms is creating some kind of interference pattern with your binding? Thomas placed a soil sample under the microscope and peered through the eyepiece. What he saw took his breath away. The sample wasn't just teeming with life. It was practically glowing with activity. Microorganisms moved in patterns that seemed almost purposeful, as if they were responding to some invisible signal. Dragon, I need you to try something for me, Thomas said, straightening up from the microscope. Can you extend your consciousness into the soil around you? Not to control it, just to observe. There was a pause, and then Thomas felt a subtle shift in the air around him. The dragon's mental presence expanded, flowing outward from its massive form and into the earth beneath it. Extraordinary, the dragon's voice whispered in his mind. I can sense them, millions upon millions of tiny minds, all connected in ways I had not imagined possible. They are aware of me, and they are... Curious? Thomas grinned, his farmer's intuition telling him he was on the right track. That's just the beginning. Now, I want you to try something that might sound strange. Instead of trying to force your absorbed kin to release their hold on you, I want you to ask the soil organisms for help. Ask them? The dragon's mental voice was incredulous. Thomas, these are microorganisms. They have no concept of cosmic beings or quantum bindings. Don't be so sure about that, Thomas replied, kneeling down and placing his hand directly on the earth near the dragon's massive head. Life is a lot more intelligent than most people give it credit for. These organisms have been evolving for billions of years, developing survival strategies that make our most advanced technologies look primitive. They understand cooperation, symbiosis, and complex problem-solving in ways that might surprise you. Thomas closed his eyes and tried to extend his own awareness into the soil, drawing on techniques he had learned from indigenous farmers who claimed to be able to communicate with the earth itself. He had always been skeptical of such practices, but now he was willing to try anything. What he experienced was unlike anything he had ever felt before. It was as if the soil was alive in a way that transcended individual organisms, a vast interconnected network of consciousness that pulsed with its own slow rhythm. And somehow, impossibly, it seemed aware of both him and the dragon. They know you're in pain, Thomas said softly, his eyes still closed. They can sense the discord within you, the way your absorbed kin are fighting against your desire for peace, and they want to help. Through his connection to the soil network, Thomas could sense something that made him gasp in wonder. The microorganisms weren't just random collections of bacteria and fungi, they were organizing themselves, forming patterns and structures that existed on multiple levels simultaneously. Physical structures in the soil, chemical communication networks, and something else that he could only describe as quantum-level information processing. "Dragon, can you feel that?" Thomas asked. "They're building something. Some kind of filter, maybe? Or a resonance chamber?" The dragon's mental voice was filled with awe. "Yes, I can sense it. They are manipulating the quantum field structures around my form, creating interference patterns that are disrupting the binding energy. But how is this possible? These organisms should not have access to quantum-level manipulation." Thomas opened his eyes and looked at the soil around the dragon with new understanding. "Who says they don't? We've been studying quantum mechanics for a few centuries, and we're just scratching the surface. These organisms have been evolving their survival strategies for billions of years. Maybe they've figured out things about reality that we haven't even discovered yet." Over the next several hours, Thomas watched in fascination as the soil around the dragon continued to change. The microscopic organisms were indeed organizing themselves in patterns that defied conventional biology, creating structures that seemed to exist partially in normal space and partially in some other dimension altogether. The dragon's breathing grew more labored, but there was a quality to it that suggested relief rather than distress. "The voices are fading," it said. And, for the first time since Thomas had met it, there was genuine hope in its mental voice. "My absorbed kin are being filtered somehow. Their consciousness is being separated from mine without destroying either of us." Thomas set up monitoring equipment around the perimeter of the crater, tracking energy levels and quantum field fluctuations. The readings were unlike anything in the scientific literature. Organized patterns of quantum coherence that suggested the presence of some kind of biological quantum computer operating at a scale he had never imagined possible. As the day progressed, something extraordinary began to happen. The air around the dragon started shimmering, like heat waves rising from summer pavement, but with a quality that suggested something far more profound than mere thermal effects. Thomas could see translucent figures beginning to form in the air above the dragon's body, vague, ghostly shapes that moved with their own volition. "The absorbed ones," the dragon explained, its mental voice growing stronger even as its physical form seemed to be diminishing. "They are being freed from my flesh, allowed to exist as pure consciousness rather than being trapped within my physical matrix." The ghostly figures were growing more distinct, taking on forms that reminded Thomas of the dragon but somehow different, older, more primal, with an alien geometry that hurt to look at directly. As each one fully manifested, it paused for a moment over the dragon's form, and Thomas could sense complex communications passing between them. "They are angry," the dragon reported, "but also grateful. They had not realized how much their imprisonment was causing them to suffer as well. They are choosing to depart this plane of existence entirely, to move on to whatever comes after physical reality." One by one, the ghostly figures rose into the sky and simply faded away, not destroyed but transcended, moving beyond the boundaries of normal space-time. With each departure, the dragon's form grew smaller, more compact, less overwhelming in its cosmic presence. By sunset, the process was nearly complete. The dragon that had once been the size of a small city was now no larger than Thomas's farmhouse, its scales gleaming with a softer light that no longer hurt to look at directly. The oppressive weight of its presence had lifted, replaced by something that felt almost peaceful. "It is done," the dragon said, its mental voice now carrying notes of wonder and relief. "For the first time in eons, I am alone in my own consciousness. The burden has been lifted." Thomas sat down heavily next to the dragon's now smaller form, exhausted by the day's events but exhilarated by what they had accomplished. "So what happens now? Are you going to be able to die like you wanted?" The dragon was quiet for a long moment, and when it finally responded, there was something different about its mental voice, lighter somehow, and tinged with an emotion that Thomas couldn't quite identify. "That is a very good question," the dragon said. "I have spent so many eons focused on ending my existence that I had not considered what I might want if that burden were lifted. Now, for the first time in memory, I find myself curious about the future." Thomas smiled, looking out over his wheat field. The crater was still there, but it was smaller now, and already he could see green shoots beginning to push up through the compressed soil. Life, as always, was finding a way to reclaim and renew. Maybe that's the point, he said. Maybe freedom isn't about ending everything. It's about having the choice to begin again. As the stars began to appear in New Harmony's clear sky, Farmer and Dragon sat together in comfortable silence, both contemplating the strange turns that life could take. The soil around them pulsed with quiet satisfaction, its microscopic inhabitants having accomplished something that no cosmic technology or ancient wisdom had been able to achieve. Sometimes, Thomas reflected, the most profound solutions came from the humblest sources. And sometimes, all it took was a willingness to listen to the wisdom of the earth itself. 3 months had passed since the day Thomas Chen discovered a dying dragon in his wheat field, and New Harmony had become a very different place. Not in any obvious way that casual observers might notice, but in the subtle ways that mattered to those who truly paid attention to the rhythms of life and growth. The crater where the dragon had lain was now a perfect circle of the most fertile soil Thomas had ever seen. The wheat that grew there was larger, healthier, and more abundant than anything in the agricultural surveys. More importantly, the soil itself had developed properties that agricultural scientists from across the Federation were coming to study. They couldn't explain why the microorganism density was so high, or how the various species had achieved such perfect symbiotic balance, but they all agreed that New Harmony's miracle soil represented a breakthrough in agricultural science. Thomas never mentioned the real cause of the soil's transformation. Some secrets, he had decided, were too important to share with bureaucrats and scientists who would inevitably want to weaponize or commercialize whatever they discovered. The dragon itself had undergone the most remarkable transformation of all. No longer the cosmic entity of terrifying power it had once been, it now existed in a form that was almost domestic. It had chosen to remain on Thomas's farm, taking up residence in the renovated barn that Thomas had expanded to accommodate his unusual new partner. "Good morning, Aurelius," Thomas called out as he entered the barn with a wheelbarrow full of feed. He had never asked the dragon's name, but after the transformation, the ancient being had chosen to be called Aurelius, a name that honored both its imperial past and its hope for a golden future. The dragon looked up from where it had been, carefully tending to a collection of seedlings. In its new form, Aurelius was about the size of a large horse, its scales now a warm golden color that seemed to glow softly in the morning light. Its eyes, once terrifying pools of cosmic fire, now held the gentle intelligence of a being who had found peace. "Good morning, Thomas," Aurelius replied, though it now spoke aloud rather than telepathically. Its voice was surprisingly pleasant, deep and resonant, but warm rather than intimidating. "The tomato seedlings are responding well to the quantum-enhanced fertilizer we developed. I believe we will have exceptional yields this season." Thomas grinned as he began distributing feed to the farm's more conventional animals, chickens, goats, and the 2 dairy cows that provided milk for the local community. It still amazed him how naturally Aurelius had adapted to farm life, applying its vast knowledge and experience to the challenges of agriculture, with the enthusiasm of a being discovering joy for the first time. "Any word from the Agricultural Extension Office about our patent application?" Thomas asked as he worked. Aurelius's expression took on a slightly mischievous quality. "They are very excited about the potential applications of bioquantum field manipulation for enhanced crop growth, though they still cannot understand how we achieved the results we described. Dr. Martinez suspects that we are withholding crucial information about our process." Thomas laughed. "Well, we are. Can you imagine trying to explain that the secret ingredient is a reformed cosmic entity working in partnership with hyper-intelligent soil microorganisms? I believe the phrase you humans use is, 'they wouldn't buy it for a second,'" Aurelius replied, carefully transplanting one of the seedlings into a larger container. Its claws, once capable of rending starship hulls, now moved with the delicate precision of a master gardener. The partnership between Thomas and Aurelius had proven to be extraordinarily productive. The dragon's vast knowledge of physics and biology, combined with Thomas's practical farming experience, had led to innovations that were revolutionizing agriculture not just on New Harmony, but across the Federation. They had developed new techniques for soil enhancement, crop rotation, and pest management that increased yields, while actually improving environmental health. More importantly, they had begun to understand the true potential of biological quantum systems. The microorganisms in New Harmony's soil had taught them that consciousness and quantum mechanics were far more interconnected than anyone had previously realized. Life itself, it turned out, was a quantum phenomenon that operated according to principles that conventional science was only beginning to glimpse. "Thomas," Aurelius said, its tone becoming more serious, "I have been thinking about our conversation yesterday regarding the expansion of our techniques to other worlds." Thomas paused in his work, and turned to face his friend. Over the months, he had learned to recognize the subtle shifts in Aurelius's demeanor that indicated important topics were about to be discussed. "The Federation Agricultural Council is definitely interested," Thomas said. "They're willing to fund a pilot program on 3 different colony worlds, with us supervising the implementation." Aurelius nodded slowly. "That is what concerns me. Not the expansion itself, but the attention it will inevitably bring. There are forces in the galaxy that would be very interested in the source of our innovations, and not all of them have benevolent intentions." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He had been so focused on the positive applications of their work that he hadn't given much thought to the potential dangers. "You think someone might figure out that you're involved?" "It is possible. There are those among the cosmic entities who knew me in my previous form, beings who would recognize the quantum signatures of my influence, even if they could not identify me directly. And there are species who have long sought the secrets of biological quantum manipulation for purposes far removed from agriculture." As if summoned by their conversation, Thomas's communication device chimed with an incoming priority message. He activated the holographic display, and the image of Federation Admiral Sarah Chen, his own niece, materialized in the barn. "Uncle Tom," Sarah said without preamble, "we need to talk. Something's happened that requires your immediate attention." Thomas exchanged a concerned glance with Aurelius before responding. "Sarah, what's wrong?" "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse than a ghost," Sarah replied grimly. "We've detected anomalous quantum signatures in 3 different star systems over the past week. The patterns match some of the theoretical models that Federation scientists have been developing based on your agricultural innovations." "But Uncle Tom, these signatures aren't coming from farming worlds. They're coming from military installations." Aurelius's scales darkened with concern. "Someone has reverse-engineered our techniques," it said quietly. Sarah's eyes widened as she noticed the dragon for the first time. In the months since Aurelius had taken up residence on the farm, Thomas had carefully avoided any video communications that might reveal his partner's presence. "Uncle Tom," Sarah said slowly, "is that a dragon in your barn?" Thomas sighed. He had known this moment would come eventually, but he had hoped to have more time to prepare. "Sarah, I need you to sit down. What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I need you to trust me." Over the next hour, Thomas and Aurelius explained everything: the dragon's arrival, the quantum liberation process, and the true source of their agricultural innovations. Sarah listened with the disciplined attention of a career military officer, asking pointed questions and requesting clarification on technical details. When they finished, Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "Uncle Tom," she finally said, "do you have any idea how many galactic treaty violations you've technically committed by harboring an unregistered cosmic entity?" "Quite a few, I imagine," Thomas replied. "But given that Aurelius is no longer the cosmic threat it once was, and considering the benefits our partnership has provided to the Federation, I'm hoping for some flexibility in interpretation." Sarah managed to smile despite the gravity of the situation. "Actually, that's not my biggest concern right now. My biggest concern is that whoever has been copying your techniques clearly doesn't understand the full scope of what they're dealing with. The quantum signatures we're detecting suggest they're trying to weaponize biological quantum systems, and if they succeed," Aurelius spoke up, its voice carrying undertones of ancient authority. "Admiral Chen, with your permission, I would like to offer the Federation my assistance in dealing with this threat. I have extensive knowledge of quantum manipulation techniques, and I may be able to identify who is responsible for these developments." Sarah studied the dragon carefully. "What kind of assistance are we talking about?" "I propose a joint mission," Aurelius said. "Your uncle and I have developed a unique working relationship that allows us to operate biological quantum systems with unprecedented precision. If we can examine the sites where these anomalous signatures have been detected, we may be able to determine not only who is responsible, but also how to counter their efforts." Thomas felt his heart rate increasing. "Wait a minute, so are you talking about leaving New Harmony? Getting involved in some kind of galactic conflict?" Aurelius turned to face him, its golden eyes reflecting depths of compassion that still surprised Thomas. "My friend, for eons I tried to avoid responsibility for the consequences of my actions. I absorbed my corrupted kin to save the galaxy, then retreated into isolation and self-pity rather than dealing with the aftermath. You taught me that true wisdom comes not from avoiding problems, but from facing them with courage and ingenuity." "But what about the farm?" Thomas asked. "What about all the work we've been doing here? The farm will endure," Aurelius replied gently. "The soil organisms we have partnered with are now self-sustaining. They will continue to thrive and spread their influence even in our absence. And the techniques we have developed have already been documented and shared with the agricultural community. Our work here has succeeded beyond our wildest hopes. Sarah leaned forward in the holographic display. Uncle Tom, I hate to pressure you, but time may be a factor. Our intelligence suggests that whoever is behind these experiments is preparing for some kind of large-scale implementation. If they succeed in weaponizing biological quantum systems, they could destabilize entire ecosystems, Aurelius finished. Or worse, create quantum cascade effects that could threaten inhabited worlds. This is precisely the kind of threat that my original people were created to counter. Thomas walked over to the barn's large window and looked out over his fields. The wheat was growing tall and golden in the late morning sun, and he could see the subtle patterns in the crop growth that indicated the presence of the quantum-enhanced soil organisms. It was beautiful, peaceful, and everything he had ever wanted from life. But it was also the result of taking a chance on something impossible, of choosing to help a desperate creature when the safe thing would have been to call the authorities and let them handle it. Now, it seemed, the galaxy was asking him to take another leap of faith. Aurelius, he said finally, if we do this, what are the chances we'll make it back to New Harmony? The dragon joined him at the window, its presence a warm and reassuring constant that Thomas had grown to depend on. I do not know, it said honestly. The forces we may be facing could be formidable, and there are always risks when dealing with cosmic-scale phenomena. But Thomas, for the first time in my existence, I have something worth fighting for. Not just my own peace, but the future we have begun to build together. Thomas looked at his friend and realized that was exactly what Aurelius had become. Not just a cosmic entity seeking redemption, but a true partner and companion. The dragon had found a new purpose in their work together, and Thomas had discovered depths of meaning he had never imagined possible in his simple farming life. Sarah, Thomas said, turning back to the holographic display, what kind of ship would we need for this mission? His niece smiled with obvious relief. I can have a Federation science vessel equipped with agricultural research facilities standing by within 24 hours. It'll give you a mobile laboratory to continue your work while providing the firepower and diplomatic immunity to operate in contested space. And the crew? Hand-picked volunteers, all with security clearances high enough to know about Aurelius without causing a galactic incident. The cover story will be an agricultural survey mission to investigate potential sites for Federation farming colonies. Thomas nodded slowly. All right then, I guess we're going to space. As they began making preparations for departure, Thomas found himself reflecting on the strange path that had brought him to this point. A year ago, he had been a simple farmer, living a quiet life on a remote world. Now he was preparing to travel across the galaxy with a reformed cosmic entity to prevent some unknown threat from weaponizing the very techniques they had developed to heal and nurture life. Aurelius, he said, as they packed their equipment, do you ever regret giving up your old power? The ability to move between stars to reshape reality with a thought? The dragon paused in its careful arrangement of soil samples and looked at Thomas with eyes that sparkled with contentment. Thomas, I spent eons believing that power was measured by one's ability to destroy and dominate. You taught me that true power lies in the ability to nurture and create. I would not trade our partnership for all the cosmic forces in the universe. That evening, as Thomas walked through his fields one last time before their departure, he felt the soil organisms responding to his presence with something that could only be described as affection. They had become partners in the truest sense, working together to create something greater than any of them could have achieved alone. The dragon's plea for death had become a celebration of life, and now that celebration was about to expand beyond the boundaries of a single world. Whatever challenges lay ahead in the depths of space, Thomas knew they would face them together. Farmer and dragon, soil and stars, life and hope united in common purpose. As the first transport ship descended from orbit to collect them, Thomas smiled and placed his hand on the rich earth of New Harmony one more time. Take care of things while we're gone, he whispered to the microorganisms beneath his feet. We'll be back. The soil seemed to pulse with understanding, and somewhere in that vast network of interconnected life, Thomas felt the promise that home would always be waiting for them. No matter how far their journey might take them among the stars,